Hello, everyone. This is Brad DeFries, Program Coordinator at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Ask the Expert, a unique opportunity to ask your asset management questions or seek advice on how to begin. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for smart management for small water system projects. The EFCN provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Workshops, trainings, and direct assistance are provided on asset management, water loss reduction, water system collaboration, fiscal planning and rate setting, energy management, funding coordination, and managerial financial leadership. I will be providing some technical support for today's session. Please take a moment to observe your GoToWebinar control panel. Most of the functions are self-explanatory, but I'd like to draw your attention to the questions section on your control panel. During today's session, you will all be kept on mute to ensure audio quality and to minimize background noise. When you would like to ask our panelists a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box, and we will direct it to the panelists. I will now do an audio check to make sure our panelists are ready to begin. Heather, are you there?
I'm here.
Dawn, are you there?
I am.
And Ross, are you there?
Yes, I am, thanks.
Great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Heather Himmelberger, Director at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at the University of New Mexico for introduction.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. We're here for another installment of Ask the Expert for Asset Management. So this is an opportunity for you to ask your questions of asset management related to asset management of myself and Ross War, who's joining us today from New Zealand. So it's actually quite early where Ross is. We've done several of these before, and it's a good opportunity for you to bring up what's on your mind regarding asset management, things that you might have questions about or troubles with or suggestions for. So while we're getting started here, you'll have a chance to type in questions, and then hopefully we'll be able to spend most of the time answering your questions. But I have asked Ross to actually talk about a topic that he's thought a lot about and done a lot of presentations on. And I think it's a really pertinent topic that as I go around the country training on asset management, it comes up a lot. And that's the idea of simplifying asset management. Sometimes we kind of get a little too complicated with it, and we could simplify it and maybe have a better time achieving the results that we would like with asset management. So I'm going to turn it over to Ross for a few minutes to talk to you about simplifying asset management. And again, as we're speaking, please take the time to write in any of your questions about asset management so that after we've talked about simplifying asset management for a while, we can actually get to your questions. So Ross, I'll turn to the next slide here, and maybe you can, okay, there we go. Maybe you can talk us through some of the simplifying asset management.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Heather, and good morning from Friday morning here in New Zealand. It's early spring here in New Zealand, and just a beautiful day. So I can tell you, if you're wondering what Friday's going to be like, if you're sitting in America on Thursday, that Friday looks like a really, really nice day. So anyway, coming back to simplifying asset management, earlier this year I had the opportunity to present in June at a major conference that was an international conference, had participants from about 30 countries here in New Zealand in the asset management stream. And one of the things I've been observing over the last maybe 18 months to a year had been that we've got a lot of manuals and books and guidance on how to do asset management now. But they're getting to be a fairly large stack of information. There's now an international standard, ISO 55000 as well. And I know in the US, you've got AASHTO have put out quite a large, like a 400 page book, and there's various guidance out of American Waterworks Association and all sorts of things like that. And then that's just the general asset management guidance, and then there's quite a lot of specific guidance around materials and life of materials and measuring those sorts of things. And it's starting to get quite complex and layers. And one of the, particularly for smaller systems, but even for some of the larger systems, my observation was that maybe we're making it far too complex, and all that complexity and all of those manuals and standards, people are losing sight of what asset management's about and the big picture. And just here in New Zealand, we have a 3-yearly cycle of asset management updating that aligns to our political cycle. Yours would be 4 years in the US. And again, the regulators have come back, having looked at all these plans have been updated, and said yet again, hey, you asset managers, you've done very, very well talking about all the technical detail, but for the community and the governance, the council or the board of directors or whoever it is, how are they going to tell the story that you're trying to tell? Because you've got all this technical detail, but you haven't really told the story of what your maybe 2 or 3 key issues are that you need the funding for. And in New Zealand now, we're now required or mandated to produce 30-year look forwards for asset management, which is a long way forwards. And those add up to billions and billions of dollars, or in some cases, in the US for the big authorities, that would be trillions of dollars. And the thing is that when you go back to Congress or you go back to state legislature or to your own directors or whatever, and you're asking for billions of dollars of funds, it needs to be more than a black box. And it needs to be, as they're looking at that slide there, the trust me, I know what I'm doing, just isn't accepted in our societies, particularly when we're asking for billions of dollars of public funds. And so part of the thinking around simplifying asset management was, well, we need to get out of this black box mode, and we need to get out of highly complex calculations unless we particularly need to do them, and get back to thinking about the components of asset management and thinking about how we explain that simply to people who aren't technical professionals. Because typically the people that are voting the funds aren't technical professionals. They're politicians, or they're people that have come from other backgrounds. And they certainly might have, or you'd hope they've got some proficiency in some profession, but not necessarily in engineering or asset management. I just wonder if we go that next slide, Heather, the one that shows the components of asset management. Yeah, so what I did was I came up, I had a look through all the data and what I'd been doing for my clients, and came up with this slide here. And the slide assumes that you've got an asset register, so it doesn't show the asset register. But fundamentally, when you're looking at life cycle management, you've got those 3 drivers. One is level of service, the second is future demand, and that might be negative demand or a declining population, a declining use of your system. And the third one is risk, and they feed into your life cycle management, where you look at your operations and your maintenance and asset renewal or rehabilitation, replacement, new capital if you've got a treatment facility or a new bore field or some new pipelines or an extension of your system, and sometimes disposal of assets. You optimize those and then you drop into your financials. And one of the things, even though we've been doing this for 2 decades now in New Zealand, we still get bogged down in the technical detail, and that's because we're technical professionals. And we quite often miss showing the line of sight from level of service through life cycle through to the financials, that say, hey, we're doing this because we need to fix something that we're not delivering service-wise that we're required to, or we need to do this because this part of our district or our city is growing, or our county. and we're doing this because we've actually got this terrible risk that if we don't do something about it, it's going to cost us 10 times what we're doing. It just makes economic sense to address that. The other thing with that diagram is financials have two parts. One is expenditure and one is revenue. And everybody, since the global financial crisis has hit, and even before that, and I think particularly smaller systems, revenue is a constant discussion. How do we pay for stuff? And if you don't have enough revenue to meet your projected expenditure, there's a discussion about how that can be brought up to speed, or how can you get additional revenue, or it might be loans or whatever, or some sort of grant or funding from state or federal government, bonds. But it may be that you just go back through the life cycle management and the levels of service and demand and say, well, we just aren't able to deliver. If people aren't going to pay or aren't willing to pay for what we think is required, what do we cut out of the programs, or what don't we do? And that's a different discussion to have with governance, with the board, with the council or state regulators, and the community that you're serving. And sometimes it's that's a discussion that needs to be had. And I think particularly if you're in an area where you've got a declining demand for the services, that is definitely a conversation that has to be had at some stage. So this diagram, I've had a bit of feedback now since I presented that back in June, and from some very senior people in the industry, and there's a general agreement that that's a fairly good description of what asset management's about, and that it's good to maintain that line of sight from levels of service and future demand and risk through your life cycle management. If we went to the next slide, Heather, what you do once you've done it the first time is you look at the gaps, and then with the further one, so if there's any gaps, you need to work out what they mean. It might be that you've got quite a lot of to take an example for argument's sake, Austin, Texas is growing very, very quickly at the moment, and obviously they would have a demand gap where they're trying to build out reticulation and additional bores and reservoir tanks and things like that to keep up with that growth. It might be that you look at your service level, the services that you're providing, say, oh, well, we're missing something in terms of our permits or our regulations or EPA requirements or whatever it is. And then the final slide in this little series here is just looking at when you get to your financials, sometimes you need to go back to the start and just go through the loop again to get everything to a level where the community and the funders are prepared to fund it, and you're meeting all your legal requirements and those sorts of things. And so I think what happens is often we get very, very bogged down in the technical detail of life cycle management. We miss some of these other drivers and pictures that we need to explain to people.
Okay, why don't we take a break there, Dawn, and see if we've had any questions come in. We can always talk more about simplifying if there's no questions, but if there's questions, we'd like to start by taking some of those now.
Yes, we have some good questions that have come in. Jim has submitted a question. He says, small utilities struggle with funding to begin an asset management program. Is there any help for planning and setting up a program?
I'll jump in and then I'll let Ross add. I would say one is the small system project that the EFC network is doing, and we do have technical assistance that's free to help you begin your program. So there are some resources available to water utilities who would like to start an asset management process. My interest in having Ross really start us off today and talking about simplifying asset management relates very much to this question, is if water utilities can keep asset management as simple as possible, they are able to do a lot of the things themselves rather than having to spend a lot of money to hire somebody to do it for them. So a lot of what we're working with small utilities now is having them really focus their strategy, at least initially, on issues that really matter to them. So maybe you're having trouble with wells, and you need to look at your wells as an asset class and determine what needs to be done and what kind of funding you need to spend and what kind of condition they're in. But you can kind of shrink your asset management program down to that one asset class as an initial starting point. Work through, what kind of condition is that in? What kind of operation and maintenance do we need to do? What kind of interventions do we need to do? By that I mean, do we need to do some major repairs or replacements or rehabilitations to our wells? How much longer are we going to use our wells? How much money do we need? And kind of just focusing the program in a very simple way to solve a problem that a water utility is having. And in so doing, you can kind of get used to how the asset management thinking works and have it help you solve a problem in maybe less of an overwhelming kind of way. Sometimes when you look at your whole utility, it feels completely overwhelming. And if you can at least as initial starting point, maybe look at asset management in terms of a specific asset or a specific type of asset, you can get yourself going without having to spend a lot of money or a lot of resources, to get started. And we are working with several utilities now in that mode of trying to get them to work through some issues and take them maybe one at a time. And maybe it takes them a couple of years to get the whole plan to cover the whole utility, but that's okay. And you can kind of build in over time, different pieces of your asset inventory. So Russ, do you have anything to add?
Look, I think that's just reminded me of very early days when I was consulting, or just before I went consulting, so about 20 years ago. And there was an authority that I went to visit. I knew the guys there, and they were relatively new. This is wastewater we're talking about. A relatively new system, and the pipes were 25 years old, and they were plastic pipes. So, you would think they were going to last 100 years. But they were on a sandy ground beside a beach, a big beach area, and so they had not very deep because they had to dewater all the time there. They had lots of pump stations, so they had something like 100 pump stations or lift stations, and the pumps had all been in sort of 25 years, so they're all coming towards the end of the life. And they bought some software, Heather, as people often do, and the software said, put all the information about your pipes in. And so they'd been doing that. They'd been spending heaps of effort doing that. And the thing is, the real risk and the real failure was around their pumps, because they were all getting towards the end of their life and they all were going to start needing replacing. And I said to them, oh, well, what about your pumps? Have you got them? And, oh, no, look, we've still got 2 or 3 years to get all our pipes into this brand new system we've got. I said, well, so where's all your information about your pumps? And they said, well, we've got Bob, the pump supervisor, and here's a little black book. And I said, oh, God, does he know his job? They said, yeah, no, he's fantastic because he's got so much work to do. And I said, so what so Bob doesn't come to work tomorrow? And all the engineers in the room just stopped, and they said, we'd be gone. We really, really rely on Bob, and if he didn't come, we'd be in so much trouble. I said, well, if it was me, I think I'd stop collecting information on my pipes and I'd start collecting information on my pumps, so that if Bob didn't come to work tomorrow for whatever reason, you'd have captured that information. And I think one of the little techniques you can do there is you can sit down on one sheet of paper and make a list of all the things you got. So you can say, hey, I've got wells, I've got tanks, I've got lift stations, I've got pressure pipe mains if it's a sewer, or I've got big pipes and I've got little pipes, and whatever else it is that you've got. And I think the easiest thing to do is say, right, based on what I know, is it in the first third, second third, or last third of its life? And then you'll come up with a couple of asset classes that are in the last third of their life. As simple as that. And you'll know about them because some of them will already be giving you some trouble. And that's where you start. And so, as Heather said, if it's your wells, or it might be you've got some really old tanks up on elevated tanks that are the stands and the tanks are just about to fall over. or whatever it is, start there, because first of all, they're going to be the first thing you have to replace, and secondly, they're the thing that are going to have the highest risk of failure. And that, in very simple terms, in a couple of weeks, you can deal with your biggest risks and your highest potential costs, just as part of your normal day-to-day work. Simply by sitting down with your maybe your senior work crew supervisors and a few of your engineers, maybe put a coffee on and around the lunch table, whatever, you'll get it out very, very quickly, and that gives everybody a bit of direction and starts a conversation in the organisation without spending any money at all.
Okay, Dawn, do we have any more questions?
Yes, Morgan asked, dealing with several decades of deferred maintenance and few written records can be quite complicated. How can we implement asset management when we do not even know the true extent of our utilities assets that exist in the field or their true age and condition, especially for buried assets?
Do you mind just repeating that question? It was a little bit, the audio version of blurred.
Sorry, I will repeat it. Dealing with several decades of deferred maintenance and few written records can be quite complicated. How can we implement asset management when we do not even know the true extent of our utilities assets that exist in the field or their true age and condition, especially for buried assets?
And I think if you go back to Ross's answer to the last question, I think that would be a good starting point. You may not know the true extent of your buried assets. You may not know exactly the condition, but you might know, as he mentioned, whether it's in the first third of its life, the middle third, or the last third of its life. So was it put in, relatively recently, in which case it would be in the first third of its life, and was it put in maybe a couple of decades ago, maybe it'll be in the middle third of its life, or was it put in 60, 70, 80 years ago, and it's in the final third of its life, to give you that starting point of, what are you dealing with? Because you're not going to know the true extent of all of the assets that are in the field, but you can have some idea of when they were first put in, and just talking to operators about what their experience is when they dig up those buried assets can give you some insight into how bad the assets are. So when they dig them up to make a repair, what are they encountering? What do the pipes look like? How are they behaving? Are they structurally sound? Do they have difficulty putting a clamp on it to make a repair because the pipe doesn't have structural integrity, or is it fairly easy for them to do that? If they've actually had to cut a piece of pipe out to replace it, what does it look like, inside, outside? So kind of combining the two things, the first approach that Ross talked about of just listing out the major pieces of assets that you have, like, the wells, you have the tanks, you have the pumps, you have pipes, that sort of thing. And then just making your best estimate of whether it's in the first third of life, middle third, or last third, kind of gets you started with at least a rudimentary idea of what the condition's like, and then supplementing that with field work, field work in the sense that you're going to talk to the operators, the people who are out there, and talk to past operators as well. If you can still, if you still know who they are and you can still contact them, don't overlook talking to past operators about what they've seen, because that will help you even think about, well, how bad was it when, John was our operator compared to now when Fred's our operator? How are things looking? And it's been 10 years, and boy, it was a whole lot better with John than Fred, so maybe it's, getting worse quickly. So you try to supplement your initial estimates of, where you are in the life cycle of these assets by what the people in the field are actually finding, to kind of give you a starting place of where to go, which is sometimes the best you can do if you don't have a lot of records, you don't have a lot of information from the past. You're just starting with your best judgment on, what's going on under the ground, or what's what's been happening over time. And Ross, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I had a precisely that situation in a town that we got where there was a big amalgamation of multiple authorities, and this little town of 5,000 people, and they had very, very poor records and very, very high, this was wastewater gain or sewer network expenditure, extremely high. And so we took what we had in terms of some, hey, maybe a pipe goes along here, and we just, this was in the days when GISs were still quite new, but we just put a map up on the wall, and anytime we found a new pipe, we drew that on the wall, and ultimately that got mapped into a GIS. But every time we got a break or a block or a overflow or anything like that, and it's the same with water, we just said to the guys that were doing the work, where is it? And we just put a little cross or a circle, depending on what it was, up on that map. And over a period of about 2 or 3 years, we knew exactly where our problems were, because they recur usually. And so then we were able to go and start doing some really targeted investigation and then some pipe replacement. And the thing is, I think as an engineer, your training is to try and get very precise records, and particularly with buried assets, you're never going to know everything. So the thing is, you can start looking at your land development records and say, right, this block was developed in 1960 or 1970. Well, you can usually be pretty safe to say there was no pipe in the ground before then. It usually goes in around the time of land development. So you can say, hey, that pipe went in that decade as a starting point. In terms of the condition, just the first thing is start plotting out your maintenance breaks. That'll take, and then get really targeted with your investigation where you're getting a lot of problems. That'll be where you've got pipe or other assets that are in very poor condition. You'll never be funded to get 100% of condition, and even if you do, you'll only have internal condition, not what's happening externally. And in terms of the extent, well, if you've got no records, you go and you hop in a ute or a truck and you go and have a look, and or you use Google Earth or Google Maps or whatever it is, Street View. You can, or you send somebody out with a tablet and start plotting it up. But that's what you do, and you don't try and do it all in 1 month, because you won't get there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen, and it actually doesn't even matter system size, because it's something that happens over and over again, no matter what the size, is people aren't prepared to kind of take the information in from the field. And I would strongly encourage you to come up with some way of capturing what people are seeing in the field. So, as Ross was mentioning, locations of breaks or even locations of pipe, if you don't know where the pipe is, and maybe they spent 4 or 5 hours trying to figure out where the pipe was, and you didn't know before then. Well, now you do, because somebody spent 4 or 5 hours figuring it out. So you need some way to capture that so that somebody else doesn't have to spend another 4 or 5 hours another time finding it, so the next time you know right where the pipe is. So you want that process in place that allows you to capture what you've learned in the field in some way that you can use. And it can be really, really simple. We've had people just put a hand-drawn map on the wall, like maybe they've downloaded a map on MapQuest or Google Earth or something as a starting place, and you can get all that stuff for free nowadays. And then they just start hand drawing on, where are the pipes? Well, okay, I don't know where they are today, but through the course of the next, year, 6 months, whatever the time frame is, my operator is going to have to dig them up for break repairs or other things, or maybe they have to do a line spot because there's construction, so they're going to have to find your line. And when they do that, that's when you capture the information, and you want a process where the operator can share that information or can put the information on the map himself, so that in the future you start to capture that information. So maybe in the past we didn't know, but in the future we will, because we've developed this process to capture that information. And like I said, even systems that have really sophisticated GIS systems, geographic information systems, oftentimes don't build in that process to figure out or to fix when they've had incorrect information in the GIS, there isn't a process for the operator to come back and say, oh, you know what, you put the pipe over here and it's really over there, or you said it's 6 inch, it's really 4 inch. And a lot of times that sort of feedback loop is missing, and you want some way to capture that information, because over time, just by capturing that field information, you will come up with a really good set of information, a really good database. And it may take you several years to get there, but that's okay. I mean, you're still progressing in a good direction. So that's something to really think about, is what way can we actually capture information from the field? What's the best way for us to do that? Is it, a map? Is it through some kind of electronic means? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it a paper-based thing? How are we going to capture the information from the field so that we can start building our database for the future, so that we will have a lot more knowledge later on than we do today? So it's okay that we don't have a lot of knowledge now, but we do want to have knowledge later on, and we do want to fix that process. So Dawn, have we had any other questions coming in?
Yes, and a comment just came in about specifically what you were talking about, capturing data in the field. I think it's worthwhile. The comment is, with digital photography, it is easy to take photos of assets, especially underground assets, during excavation or repairs. Goes along well with the written documentation. And I think that we talk about that a lot in our trainings and workshops too. So Heather, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent, excellent comment. And as Dawn said, we do talk about that in our basic asset management training, because that is absolutely correct. Like with digital photography now, I mean, it's amazing the records you can create that even 10 years ago would have been very difficult to do. And you can capture pictures of your assets above ground when you go out and do inventory, maybe even annually. You take a picture of your assets and you can look at them over time. When it's underground, certainly whenever they're digging up the asset, that'd be a great time for the operator to snap a picture, and then you have a permanent record of what it looked like at that moment in time, with the only caution being to have some way to label that picture and document the time the picture was taken, because if you wait too long, you'll end up with a bunch of pictures and you won't know exactly what they're of, because pipes start to look the same. So you want to date stamp the picture somehow and title it, but that's absolutely correct that there's great ways to keep data through digital photography, and it can be very, very helpful. Ross, I don't know, in New Zealand, are they doing a lot with digital photography? Do you see systems using that as part of their record keeping?
Yes, we do, Heather, and I think it's just anytime you've got a pipe open now, somebody should be taking some photos of what you've got, simply because that's a good opportunity. But just while you were saying that, I was thinking of one of our clients a while ago, and a smaller rural authority, lots of small towns with quite small systems. I think they've got, they look after 30 distinct systems in a whole lot of small towns and areas, and spread over quite a large geographical area. And one of the things that they felt they were missing, and above all of the keeping digital photos in that, was that their engineers and their asset managers were losing what they would say is a feel for what was going on in the field. And it's just being able to make the right decisions quickly sometimes when you need to. So what we did was we helped them, and we said, hey, let's look at your risk profile of your pipes, and we'll categorize them really simply. There'll be low risk pipes, there'll be medium risk pipes, and there's high risk pipes. And we said, well, look, we're going to have treat these differently. So when with a low risk pipe, typically in a just a small back of the town or one single street or whatever it was, their standard was they could have up to 5 breaks over 2 or 3 years, I think, from memory, before they'd replace that pipe, and they didn't need engineers involved for those ones. At the other end of the scale, with the high risk pipes, and this would be maybe a feed in from the bore field to the town, or if you lose that, everybody's out of water type thing, they made a decision that when they got a break, not only would they take the digital photos, but they would call the engineer and that they would go and have a look. So that before you fixed the pipe and or as you were fixing it, you had your field supervisor and your senior engineer standing looking at the hole, talking about the problem, talking about whether they needed to do something about it there and then, needed to replace the pipe or whatever. So what we were trying to do is say, hey, look, in these high-risk circumstances, we want all the experience we can bring to bear on that problem so that we don't overlook it and so that everybody stays on top of it. And that, I think, has worked very, very well for them. So that they're still collecting those records, but also, there's nothing like having experienced heads looking at problems at the right time to make sure that they don't get worse problems.
So keep those digital photos coming. Great idea for the asset management. And if you don't have a camera, that might be an investment that your utility wants to make, either through some kind of smartphone that takes pictures or, a tablet kind of device or just a camera itself. They're actually not very expensive these days. So if you don't have a digital camera at your utility, I think it's, well worth the investment. Dawn, do we have any other questions coming in?
Yes, about the presentation from Ross. It says, I don't quite understand how to use this diagram. Is this a bird's eye view, or can you walk us through an example of how to use this diagram?
I'll let you take that one, Ross.
Thank you. Look, the walkthrough on the diagram takes about 4 hours in terms of looking at the detail. Simply and very quickly, if we're looking at the one with that's still up at the moment, the number 3 diagram, you've got your levels of service around your that you're delivering. That might be a certain pressure of water, or the water's fit, the quality specification of the water, the chemicals you're taking out of it, or the metals, or whatever like that. It might be the quantity of water. So you've gone through or your ability to respond to a break or a fault. So that you've got that list of levels of service, and they all, at the end of the day, have operational and or maintenance and or renewal actions that you have to undertake to consistently deliver that. You've got to run a water treatment plant, you've got to take the arsenic out, whatever it is. They all have a cost associated. So delivering levels of service, however you've defined them for your water authority, is a key part of asset management. The changes in demand are the next key part. So it may be that you've got a big new industry, wet industry coming that's going to take water from you. It may be that you've had one of those and they're actually leaving your area. Your population might be growing or it might be declining, or there's all those factors. And so understanding, and in the demand as well, obviously, very topical in the US at the moment, is what do you do when you've got drought and you can't, you've not got enough water coming into your system, or you've got to restrict the water. So that's all around demand planning, and that has impacts on how you operate, maintain, replace, but it also can have quite big impacts on your expenditure and your revenue. I think Heather on the INFRAMANAGE blog a while ago made the point that in California, if they make a 30% reduction in water use, that's a 30% reduction in volumetrically charged revenue, which is going to create problems for the water authorities there. So there's a looking at demand and how does that impact on how you manage your assets and deliver your services, and both your expenditure and your financials. And then there's that risk, and we were just talking about that a minute ago. Some assets are higher risk, some activities are higher risk, some, typically the risks you don't think about are the ones that will catch you out if they're big ones. And managing or mitigating or taking those risks so that they actually don't, you can deal with them, or all sometimes have a change the way that you manage the life cycle of your assets, how you operate, how you maintain, how much preventative maintenance or you do, or cyclic maintenance. Sometimes with a very important asset, you might in fact choose to replace it well ahead of time. You're not going to run it to failure. in your treatment plants and pump stations, that risk might be if I've only got one pump, then I need to be right on top of the repairs and the maintenance of that. If I've got 3 pumps, then maybe one can fail before I have to get too worried about it. And they all impact, and then that all impacts on the life cycle decisions you make, impact on what you spend. What you spend impacts on the revenue that you need. So that's how that diagram works. A very, very simplified view, helicopter view, if you like, of asset management, and then digging into each one of those topics can take quite a while. Though I understand Heather's got some very good training that the EFC network offer around those topics. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just another opportunity to sort of bring us back to the idea that it's really about the thinking part. This is something that I spend a lot of time talking about, and I know Ross gets into it as well, is the how you think about your assets is really the most important part of asset management. I mean, you will have some kind of computer or hand tools that, like a map or something like that will help you with your asset management process. But the most important part is just to be able to think about your assets. And so what Ross has presented is kind of on the left-hand side, what do you want your assets to do, which is kind of your level of service. What are you going to need them to do in the future? And then what risks might you face in terms of, what assets are going to cause you risk in order to be able to meet what it is you need to do? And then how are you going to maintain your assets to kind of meet future demands, meet current demands, and then how are you going to pay for it? So it really comes down to just how are we going to think about our assets. And, as Ross mentioned, I did do a blog post a little while ago about, when they've cut usage in California so drastically. I mean, that's a great thing to do in terms of future demand, but it created a risk. It created a big risk for those utilities because many of them were already facing inability to replace aging infrastructure or decaying infrastructure. And when you cut the usage, you cut revenue, and you cut revenue a whole lot more than you cut expenses because most utilities generate most of their revenue based on volumetric charges, but most of their expenses are fixed. They're kind of independent of how much water you produce. So you've created this risk for the California utilities that said, okay, well, we had to meet the future demand of less usage, but now we have this risk that we can't replace aging infrastructure or maybe even keep up with basic maintenance because we're going to have less revenue. And it could be somewhere on the order of 30% if they cut 30% use, or it could be a little more, a little less, depending on how they collect their revenue. But by changing levels of service and changing future demand, you created a risk of how are we now going to operate our utility, maintain it, do renewals based on these revenues. So I think it's what he's presented is a really great way to think about your assets and think about what's going on in your system so that you're better able to handle things as they come along, and at least you can think through, well, now what do we do? Now what do we do when we have less usage? Do we have to raise revenue? Do we have to cut service? What is going to change based on, our new situation? Dawn, do we have any additional questions?
Yes. Becky writes, we have little to no records on the system assets, so we have recently started doing an inventory of manholes, valves, etc. How do you recommend numbering the assets? It seems a bit overwhelming.
Well, I'm going to give you an answer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ross. There are basically 2 ways you can do it, and there's probably, or 2 ways that I hear in the U.S. that people have done it, and then I'm sure there are ways in New Zealand that they get into it. So like I said, I'll let Ross weigh in as well. But we hear one method is just to give it its random number and not worry too much about giving it a smart number, letting either the computer choose it or you choosing just, an independent random number that's like 126574 or something. And many computer programs will just randomly number assets along that way. And some people swear by that approach, saying, you know, it's easier, it doesn't tie an asset to a location. So if you moved an asset from one place to another, it doesn't cause any problems. The other way to number your assets is to develop a numbering scheme. That's what we call a smart numbering scheme, where there are maybe a series of numbers and letters that identify that asset, and they will tell something about where the asset's located, something about what type of asset it is, and then maybe a number because there might be more than one of those assets. So for example, if it's a well pump at the Main Street pump house, maybe you have WP for well pump, maybe you have an MN for Main Street, and maybe 001 because maybe there's 3 of them. So it has a series of numbers and letters that end up, you know, giving you some information about that particular asset. And there's, you know, kind of 2 schools of thought. Some people swear by the latter approach, some people swear by the former approach. I think either one can work. Where people have had difficulties is if they move assets around a lot. And some larger utilities do that a lot, where they take one pump from, say, the Main Street pump house and move it to the Elm Street pump house. And now the MN doesn't work anymore because that's not where it is, but you don't really want to have to renumber that asset. In a smaller utility, there's a lot less movement of assets around, so it probably works a lot better to have the locational or smart numbering systems in the smaller utilities than the larger utilities, where again they're trying to move things and that can create some difficulties. So Ross, I'll let you weigh in on that question as well.
Well, I think it's a very good question from Becky. Just to give you a little bit of background there, Becky, I've just finished updating the sections of the International Infrastructure Manual on data management and asset information systems, and that question falls within that. So that's the new updates, 2015 update. I did the same thing back in 2011 for that manual. I think the interesting thing is if you're using a GIS, and so for reticulation and the point assets, the hydrants and the valves on reticulation, normally these days you'd be using some sort of mapping system. Then the sequential number that the GIS assigns is fine, or if you've got a system that's linked to the GIS, just because typically you're just looking at a map and going, hey, it's the 4-inch pipe on Elm Street. Hopefully it's not the nightmare on Elm Street because it's been bad, but yeah, that's how you do it. It's the hydrant off that pipe on Elm Street. So you're typically thinking spatially to do that. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is when you're talking about particularly treatment facilities, where they're all at one spot, but you could have multiple assets that are very similar there, and also multiple treatment processes that are paralleled or that. And I think that's where that hierarchical named asset works quite well. So what I'd say is don't be afraid to mix it up. Don't be afraid to, for your linear assets, use just a sequential code based on a GIS number that's linked to the database or whatever. As long as you maintain the link, you're fine. And for your treatment assets, it might be, hey, this is treatment plant 1, it's process 1, and it's pump number 3 in that process. And so you come up with a naming. The other thing is with treatment plants, depending on what you're doing, often those assets are tagged as well with a number and referenced in your, if you're using a maintenance management system for the treatment plant, those numbers are tagged as well. So often if you've got a tagging system going on, just use those numbers and link them with a photo and into whatever other system you're holding. And I think that sometimes we're just give yourself the freedom to use different systems for the treatment plants than for the linear assets. It works really well.
Okay, Don, do we have any other questions?
Yes. Are there any templates that you are aware of that can serve to track assets? Something simple that is already developed, which contain headings indicating the information one should track for assets. For example, asset type, location, age, etc.
Well, we have developed a very simple spreadsheet and database that is available through the efcnetwork.org website. That's efcnetwork.org. Very, very simple and meant to be a starting place. You may want to add fields or different information, but very, very simple. There are many, many, many programs out there on the market. Some of them are very, very simple and easy to use and meant for the smaller utilities. There's EPA has a CUPS program that has some inventory information in it that's free. So there's a lot of different places you can go to, help you out with inventorying information. Some of them are better for what Ross has termed linear assets, where we talk about the field, pipes, valves, hydrants, and some are better for treatment plants. Some do well at both. It kind of depends on what your level of expertise is with software, how much money you have to spend. But there are some really good programs out there that are not very expensive for small utilities that are starting to really help you capture information, inventory information, without too much complexity. You want to be careful. There are some programs that are very, very, very complex, and most little utilities don't need anything like that. They're really meant for the much larger utilities, and some of them are even meant for major industries more so than water or wastewater utilities, and they can be used for water and wastewater, but they're actually developed for folks who are running a major manufacturing plant or something like that. So of course we want to avoid that kind of complexity, but there are many programs out there on the market that will help you with a small utility. And Ross, I'll let you weigh in on that question as well.
Yeah, I think keep it simple initially. Use the industry templates that are available. When we started this exercise 20 years ago back in New Zealand, there was nothing. So there was a group of us sat down and sort of developed something, and everybody grabbed it. It was just like a user group almost. So EFC Network's done some of that sort of thinking. I think the main thing is size it for what the level of detail you need for what you're managing, and no more than that. That's the tricky bit, because it can be like the hamster wheel. Otherwise, you can end up just trying to collect far too much information at far too much detail, because you're using this template or whatever, and you just get sucked into turning that wheel, and you're not achieving very much, and you're sucking huge amounts of resource into an exercise that you'll never finish if you go too complex. So I think using EPA or the EFC one as a starting point, and then start thinking about whether you do actually need to add any complexity to that, and then do that only where you have to.
Okay, Don, do we have any additional questions?
Yes. With aging infrastructure and limited, if any, records, are there any tools or best practices for figuring replacement costs for assets and/or their classes?
Okay, tools to figure out costs. I don't know of any particular tool that's set up for that exact purpose, to say, here's a piece of pipe, how much will it cost? You certainly can use past experience as part of your guide. How much have you spent in the past on replacing, say, a mile of pipe? How much in the past have you spent on replacing wells? You can use your neighbor's experience. If you have neighboring utilities who have just had to drill a well or had to replace some pipe, you can ask them. Another place you can go is your state revolving funds people who fund projects, because they may have some information about costs from other projects. If you have an engineer that you work with, somebody that does maybe routine work with you and would be willing to provide some advice on what it costs for a mile of pipe or a pump or a pump station or something like that, you might want to ask them if they have any costs So there's a couple of different ways that you can go about it. I don't know of any actual tool, but maybe Ross knows of a tool that does replacement cost. Ross, do you know of anything that's specific to replacement cost?
No, I think we pretty much do the same thing as you've described there, Heather. The only advantage we've got here is everybody's required to do asset valuations, and to do that it's a replacement cost valuation. So every water utility in New Zealand's got to come up with some sort of replacement cost anyway, and they can get aggregated up across regions and areas. And so we've got some databases. But I think one of the best examples I saw of that was an authority, and maybe I think they were about 50,000 population looking after, it was just a town, or we call it a city here. They had a university college student come in every year. They'd get them in for Christmas holiday work, or in your case summer holiday work, and they'd grab all of those construction costs over the past year from all of their records, because they're always doing something. The thing is, you've got to adjust them as well. So they just put them into a spreadsheet, and they adjusted the cost for inflation and for the cost of capital and things like that. And they just kept a series of graphs, and they could work out what their average cost per mile, per depth, or per type of pipe was from that information. It was really, really useful. And the trick to it was just keeping it up to date every year, and it wasn't a big cost, and it wasn't a big effort, and really good exercise for a keen young engineering college student to do every year at Christmas time. So, and that's our main summer holiday here. So in your case, your summer holidays effectively.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the end of our time today. We only have an hour webinar today. So if there's any other questions out there, we will answer those in written form and get the answers out to you following the webinar. I want to thank my colleague, Ross, who so graciously donated his time to be here today with us, and I really appreciate his willingness to share his insight from his many years of doing all kinds of asset management practice. Russ and I have worked together for years, and I value that relationship because it really helps me learn what's going on in other countries that I can bring to the U.S. and add to our training. So it's always such a pleasure to be on these webinars with Ross. And I want to thank all of you for sitting in today and for sharing those wonderful questions with us. It's always great if we can tailor it to the kinds of things that are on your mind. We will have a recording of the webinar, so if there's anybody that you want to listen to it later, you can refer them to our website and you'll be able to find the recorded webinar. We also do blog posts through the, let me put up the first page again, hang on one second, through INFRAMANAGE.com, and you'll see INFRAMANAGE down there in the bottom right hand corner. There are blog posts about these kinds of issues that will come up later on, and you're welcome to go there and read blog posts about asset management. So there are resources to help you. It is a big task to take on asset management, but you can simplify it as much as possible and look for those resources to help you because they are out there. Ross, do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, I think thank you very much to everybody that's listened, and I think thank you to Dawn and Brad for just helping us with the administration, and it's been a very enjoyable hour to spend with people. So.
All right, well, thank you all. Again, if you have interest in if you're under a 10,000 population utility, we do have free assistance to help you with asset management. Please contact us. We are happy to assist you any way we can. And look out for another one of these, probably in about another quarter. We'll have another Ask the Expert webinar. We'll focus on some other topics and answer additional questions that you may have. And again, thanks to Brad and Dawn and Ross